Great pleasure right now to welcome a man who's written a very fascinating book. It's called His Father's Son, Earl and Tiger Woods. We're joined by New York Times bestselling author Tom Callahan, also former senior writer for Time Magazine and the Washington Post. He's written other great sports books, including the one about Johnny Unitas recently. And we're joined by Tom Callahan today by telephone. How are you, Tom?
I'm great, Doug. How are you?
Great to have a chance to talk to you. And when we had the blurb that you're going to be available to do interviews, I wanted to get you on. I guess the question you're probably getting is, when did you decide to write this book? Was this before last Thanksgiving when Tiger began to have his troubles, or after?
Yeah, all my friends think that when the car hit the tree, Callahan started typing. But the truth is, I'd already contracted for this book, and it was going to be called His Father's Son, months before that. And I was well into it. I'd already been to Kansas to check out all of Earl's lies about his background, and I'd already talked to the first family, to the siblings. I was well into the project. It actually began in a fun way, probably in '97, because that's the year I went to Vietnam looking for Tiger Fong, Tiger Woods' namesake, and I found he died in a re-education camp in Hanoi. And I brought his widow and a couple of his 9 children back to Cypress, California, to see Earl and Tita and Tiger. Tiger came west from Orlando just for that, and I spent the day with Tiger, in his room, and he was very sweet to these people. I expected him to be dutifully polite to them, because to be honest with you, I don't think he really cared about this, but he pretended to care because his father cared. And he went out of his way. I brought him into his room and showed him, his Star Wars junk. And he was very, I've seen him at his best. But from that experience, I became friends with Earl. And through the years, I saw him off, half a dozen times a year. I probably sat in that living room and listened to his stories. And he would call me, and we would see each other at the British always, because Earl was the guy who didn't have to see Tiger in person. He'd come in for the kiss at the end, but usually he'd watch on television. And I'd go watch a round with him, one of Tiger's rounds with him, almost every tournament, big tournament. So I came to know him quite well.
Earl's a fascinating character in a sense, because a lot of people may not know he had a family before the wife he had with Tiger. I mean, that family had with Tiger. We had several children, but people don't really know about that. He had an interesting career in the military, and was also a baseball player, I believe, in college baseball. So he really had an interesting life even before we knew him as Tiger's father, right?
Right. He was a fabulous Earl. The only thing he didn't lie about was Vietnam. But soldiers who were in Vietnam don't lie about it. And I did a Freedom of Information Act request for his military records, and his Vietnam stories checked. But the only thing in his life that checks.
Is that right?
He wasn't the first. He was the only black baseball player at Kansas State when he was there in the mid-'50s. But he wasn't the first black baseball player at Kansas State, or the first black player, athlete in the conference, like he wrote and always swore he was. And furthermore, he knew the guys who were. The guy who was the first black athlete in the Big 7, now the Big 12, was a neighbor of his, literally on the same block, on the same street as he did. Earl borrowed several parts of his biography for his own biography. And the true story, Earl's true story, is fantastic enough. A 42-year-old black soldier, too much for retirement, picks up a golf club for the first time in his life and changes the game. But it wasn't enough for him. He needed to be great, and he had to, he had to embellish to the point, to kind of a silly point, comparing Tiger to Gandhi and, Mandela and things. But he had a charm, too. If you knew him long enough, nobody who ever met him 2 or 3 times ever saw it, but eventually he'd come clean with you. And you could kind of joke him. At least I could laugh him out of it. He would start telling stories about how Tiger, he was talking to the TV screen, and Tiger called him and said, "I heard you, Pop, thanks." I said, "Hey, Earl, I know some writers you can tell that story to. You'd probably write it. Give me a break. Leave me out of that, And he would laugh. And he'd say, "Well, you don't mind if I believe it, do you?" I said, "No, knock yourself out, But as I said, I liked him, and he wasn't perfect, and he had some things to answer for. He's kind of to blame. He's kind of the hero and the villain, because he gave Tiger the dream, taught him how to achieve it, but then he's also the guy who showed him how to ruin it.
Mm. Yeah, obviously the father has had his situation not unlike what Tiger has been through the last year, right?
Yeah, well, he was openly, open womanizer. Or a player is the word he preferred. He wasn't shy about it. He was shameful about it, really. And he was mean to Tita at the end, and he was mean to his first wife. I talked to his first wife. She wanted to dig him up and kill him again, but I didn't let her. I tried not to. I tried to be honest in this book. I told Tiger was worried about this. Of course, now it's the least of his worries, but he was worried, and I told him, I said, I'm not going to turn him into St. Francis of Assisi, but I'm not going to try and kill him either, and it was the same with Tiger. I didn't go looking for any of the floozies to talk to him. I didn't care, and I didn't go looking for Earl's girls, though I could have found them. I'm more interested in kind of this interesting dynamic of these two people, these two characters who they're kind of a cautionary tale, but they're, I find them both incredibly interesting.
Would you say if there was a show business story, and maybe Earl was his mom, it would be kind of like Gypsy, right? Like a stage mom in a sense, living living through his son as a star, and he's like the stage father. Would that be a similar analogy you could make with Earl?
Of course, he would bitterly deny it.
Yeah.
He would bitterly deny it. I never lived through Tiger. You can laugh if you want. Well, of course, I would be laughing because it's obvious he lived through him. In every way he lived through him. And even though he had it, on his own hook, Earl did things. He had a life. There were things he could be proud of. There weren't all that many black officers in the Army, in the 50s, so, Earl had things to be proud of. And he also had some grievances, he had some black bitterness about him that he tried to convey to Tiger. Tiger's the whitest black guy who ever lived. It's easy to be brave about another guy's pain, and there's no doubt that anybody walking around with a black face in America knows something about racism, and Tiger certainly does too. But if you've been in that house where he grew up, it's around the corner from Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm. He borrowed all of his racial grievances from Earl, and Earl taught him. I'm sorry to say, he kind of taught him how to be aggrieved, and I think Tiger, if he was honest and he was in this conversation, I think he'd agree with that.
Do you think Tiger has received any kind of instinct now that he's going to be able to extricate himself from what he's put himself through with the last year? Do you think he can turn it around?
Well, I think that's the way to root. Redemption is available to Tiger Woods as much as that to anybody, I guess. But Tiger, it's hard for him to be different because the way he is, the things that make him the way he is, he thinks that they're necessary to be what he is. He's afraid. He knows his flaws. Even though, he's a cheapskate, for instance, but he doesn't want to change because he's afraid of changing. And of course now, he hasn't been able to look himself in the eye for about a year, but that'll wear off. You and I both know lots of scoundrels who succeed at sports,
sure.
And so virtue isn't a requirement, but it's going to be hard for him to get back to kind of his position. He used to beat a lot of these guys just the way he walked and the way he looked at them, and he doesn't look or feel deserving anymore. And none of them, the players in the locker room, it's not that they have contempt for him, it's just that they don't have awe for him to the same extent they did. He's not an extraordinary person, he's just an extraordinary golfer. It's like, Kobe Bryant, and Ben Roethlisberger, they were never extraordinary people, they were never in Tiger's class, but he's in their class now. And all the people who followed Tiger who didn't follow golf, they're gone. And they're gone forever. He's never going to be selling Buicks on TV again. Because this was beyond womanizing. It was darker. It was sadder. And I'm not going to be surprised if he pops up and has big moments or wins a big tournament by any means. I think he's one of the best players. But I'm going to be stunned if he returns to the dominant Tiger Woods we knew, especially 7, 8, 9 years ago.
Well, I know we have limited time today, and we could talk for a long time on this fascinating topic, but the name of the book is called His Father's Son, Earl and Tiger Woods. We've been talking with Tom Callahan. Tom, you want to give out a website real quick? People can get the book.
I guess it's just Amazon.
Yeah, we'll find out. So just Google Tom, and you can find it.
I'm from another century. I can barely turn on the machine, but today's the pub date, so as of today, I guess it's on Amazon, and it should be in bookstores.
Great. Tom, appreciate you taking your time, and look forward to doing it again. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, I enjoyed talking with you.